Okay, welcome everybody, and we appreciate you joining us for our third Teaching with Technology webinar, our first one for 2017. Tonight's topic is going to be promoting collaboration in online learning communities. And honestly, a lot of what we're talking about could work very well in face-to-face classes too. And I'm starting out with a little cartoon since tonight's topic is going to be on group projects. And we have on the left-hand side here what we as instructors hope that group projects teach students: communication, responsibility, collaboration, and teamwork, all wonderful things. And then we have on the right-hand side what many students perceive as they're doing group projects. They learn a fraction of communication, responsibility, collaboration, and teamwork, but largely they learn to trust no one. So hopefully after tonight's webinar, we will have some strategies to prevent that from happening. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll start out by talking about the importance of collaborative activities. We're teaching in a rapidly evolving world, obviously. And while we teach our students our content knowledge, the materials that are related directly to our course, it would be great if we can increase the value of our lessons by also teaching skills such as higher level thinking and problem solving, critical thinking, creative thinking, oral communication and written communication, the ability to identify the important aspects of masses of information, because as you know, students and we as instructors are confronted with tons of information every day between news sources and books and the types of things that we look at on the internet, and we need to be able to identify what's important and what's truthful in all of that information. In other words, we need information literacy. If we could teach our students self-management and the importance of personal responsibility to oneself and to one's peers, teach students leadership, and if we could expose students to diverse perspectives and give them an increased understanding of diverse perspectives. And those are all the things that collaborative group work activities do. Research shows that educational experiences that are active, social, contextual, engaging, and student-owned, or in other words, that are collaborative, develop those skills that are discussed above there and lead to deeper learning. What's the importance of teaching students all of those skills? According to Hart Research Associates, these are the skills that employers want from our graduates. Pretty much everything that I mentioned on that last slide: critical thinking and analytical reasoning, complex problem solving, written and oral communication, information literacy, innovation and creativity, teamwork skills in diverse groups, and quantitative reasoning. So if these are the things that we are teaching our students, we are definitely preparing our students for the workforce. So how can we avoid this red experience of trust no one? The first thing that we recommend when planning group work is to form groups carefully. Normally, when I do group assignments in my class, I do a preliminary assessment of the students, and based on the results of that assessment, I purposefully create groups that blend student abilities. What does that assessment look like? I ask the students to rate their comfort level or abilities based on their own opinions of themselves on a number of skills. Depending on the group project, some of those skills might be their research skills, their technology skills, maybe their knowledge of the topic of the project going into the project, any work experience that might benefit them for the project, things like that. And then I try to arrange the groups to include experts in different areas. So I don't have all of my tech-savvy students in one group and all of my information literate students in another group, that sort of thing. And I communicate my reasoning for forming groups in the way that I form them, so that the students understand, look, you're going to be the technology expert in this group. You're going to be the research expert in this group. And I want you to share those skills with the other members of your team and help the other members of your team develop those skills. That doesn't mean that I want you to do all the research. That means I want you to take the lead in that aspect and help people develop their skills. That doesn't mean I want you to do all the technology work, but that means I want you to be the one to suggest great technology ideas and help people learn more how to use the technology, that sort of thing. So once the groups are formed, the next thing that we recommend is that the instructor guides the groups carefully. Help the students assign specific tasks or roles to each team member based on their identified strengths, or pair students with opposite strengths and assign each student to do the part of the assignment that requires their weaker skill and task the other student with mentoring them. So what are some of the team roles that you might assign to students? We're going to look at 4 primary types of roles, and they won't be the ones that we traditionally think about when we think about forming groups for group projects. The first one is the facilitator. The facilitator might be the strongest leader in your group. They provide leadership and direction for the group. They may lead discussions. They provide or suggest solutions to team problems. They help to clarify points. They keep the group from getting too contentious. They make sure that everybody is heard. They help to refocus the group when they stray off of task. And they might say things like, let's hear from such and such person next, or that's interesting, but let's get back to our task. In other words, refocusing. Another group role might be the summarizer. This person in the group would restate the group's conclusions and responses, prepare a summary of the group's efforts, probably during the group meeting. In other words, they might be like the secretary of the group. They check for clarity of understanding, their own, and they make sure that everybody else is understanding. And they'll say things like, does this accurately reflect what we've done today? Have I left out anything important here? The next type of group role that we might assign is the recorder. This person would be responsible for keeping a public record of the team's ideas and progress. In other words, they would do the write-up, the final write-up of each group meeting, and provide the summary of that write-up in some way, whether that would be into the discussion forum in Moodle, or whether it would be as a typewritten assignment that was submitted in Moodle, whatever that may be. But they are the final recorder of what happens in each meeting. And they also obviously would have to check to make sure that the ideas that they're recording are clear and accurate. And maybe they'd use charts or multiple colors or other techniques to highlight and summarize the important ideas of each meeting. And then finally, you might have the presenter who presents the group's finished work to the class. If you're doing something in class, then this might be the person who you call on to summarize that day's work. Or if you're asking people to report back on their group assignment that they've been working on outside of class, the presenter would be who you would call upon to give that report back. And depending on the size of the class or the size of the groups, these roles can be combined, obviously, or they can also be expanded into other potential group roles, like a data collector. That might be somebody with strong research skills, a checker, an elaborator, even an encourager or a materials manager or a timekeeper. Once again, the point here is none of these roles are the ways that students, if left to their own designs, would typically divide up group work. Students tend to divide things up into the person who does all the research, the person who writes it up, the person who does any technical things like graphic design, and then the person who presents. And those may be reasonable ways for your students to divide up a project. But they do also tend to lead to that feeling of, I did so much more of the work than anybody else. So if you use some of the other potential group roles that we talked about, you may tend to avoid that type of feeling. Okay, moving along. What else can the instructor do to ensure successful group work? One of the most important things probably is managing the group assignment. The biggest thing in that is going to be helping the students to break a large assignment into smaller pieces. And one of the things we recommend is try to avoid doing this for them. Rather than saying in your syllabus, on this day you're going to turn in your topic, in this day you're going to turn in your first source for your research, on this day you're going to turn in an annotated bibliography, or things like that. Try to have the students define what will be the stages in the project, and you're working together with them in a group. If you're online, maybe in a chat room or in a webinar or in a discussion forum, or if you're in a face-to-face class, you can dedicate a couple of minutes to one of your first classes, maybe the same day you go over the syllabus, to this. Have them define what the pieces of the project are going to be, and get them to talk about when they should be due. That helps them develop an understanding of why, of what you're doing with the project and why things are being divided up the way they are, and it kind of gives them a little sense of ownership. And if then they don't meet one of those deadlines, you kind of have the ability to say, hey, you guys set this, so you should have been able to meet it. Once the assessment stages are defined, do be sure to define multiple deadlines with a specific product that the students are required to submit, so that you can ensure that students are continuously reaching milestones throughout the process rather than pulling it all together 5 minutes before class. And obviously, the purpose of this webinar, include formal peer and instructor feedback at each one of the stages of the project to provide increased opportunities for critical thinking, exposure to diverse opinions, and leadership and personal responsibility. Now, that's a lot of work. Surely there's a tool to help us manage it. Yes, there is. We're going to be talking in this webinar about the Moodle workshop activity. But before we get into that, I want to go ahead and stop and see whether there are any questions that anybody has about what I've talked about so far. I don't see anything in the chat, and I don't think I see anything in the questions session. Nothing showing up for me just yet. So I'll go ahead and move along and introduce the Moodle workshop activity. The Moodle workshop activity can be used in an online course, obviously, or it can also be used in face-to-face classes. And what the workshop activity does is it allows students to submit any type of submission that they can normally submit to Moodle, like a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or a link to a video or images, like an infographic, anything like that. Or, as you know, you can also have your students type directly into a text editor in Moodle, so it will allow that type of a submission. Once the student's work is submitted, in the Moodle the thing that makes Moodle Workshop different from any other assignment submission is once the work is submitted, the students have the ability to assess either their own work and or one of their peers' work based on a form or a rubric that the instructor creates. So you can require your students to turn something in and then do a self-assessment, or turn something in and assess each other, which is a really great way for them to think critically about what they're doing at each stage of the research project or group project that you're having them do. At the end of the workshop activity, the students get 2 grades, one for their submission and one for the quality of their assessment of their peers' submissions, or the quality of their assessment of their own work. And both of the grades are recorded in the grade book. So the students they're kind of forced to be thoughtful about the work that they've turned in. And I really like that because this activity in Moodle requires the students not to just turn something in and forget about it. They're not able to do that. They turn it in and then they have to keep thinking about it, keep analyzing it, reflect on what they did well or what they didn't do well, learn a little bit for themselves about their own work, be self-critical, which is a really great skill for them to develop. Okay, how could you use the Moodle workshop activity? At what point of the process of group work should you use it? You can use the Moodle workshop activity at any point when the students are working on individual contributions to a group assignment. So in other words, if you have divided your group assignment up into discrete things that the students need to turn in, you could have a workshop activity for them to assess each one of those stages. If you're doing a research paper in your class, you may have a workshop activity for them to analyze their thesis, and then another one for them to analyze their annotated bibliography, and another one for them to analyze a rough draft of their research project. You may encourage them to do a workshop activity for their sources and have them turn in one of their sources and analyze it using the CRAP test. The CRAP test, if you're not familiar with it, CRAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So a student would turn in an article that they were considering using as part of their research for their research paper, and they'd have to analyze it and say, is this a good article for my research paper? Is it current? Is the material in it relevant to my research paper? Is the author of the research paper that of the source that I'm considering using, is he or she really an authority? In other words, is this published in a peer-reviewed journal, that sort of thing? Is the source accurate? And what was the purpose of the source? Was it published in a peer-reviewed journal, or is the purpose of this source just to teach somebody, like a webinar like this one? Or was it actually even worse? Was it entertainment? So that CRAP test is a really good way to get students to analyze their sources and think about whether they're using the type of sources that you want them to use in their research paper. And having them do that through the Moodle workshop activity might be a really great way to use this activity. And then obviously you can use the Moodle workshop activity for the final product of research projects and problem-based learning assignments, creative writing, anything like that. Okay, what type of feedback can you get from the Moodle workshop activity? You can do anything, a large range of activities, anything from simple mechanical feedback. Does the submission meet some sort of strictly defined criteria? Like, for example, does it have typographical errors? Does it have grammar errors? Does it have spelling errors? Does it have the proper number of sources? Things like that, purely mechanical things. Or you can ask your students to provide a critical analysis of the submission, answering questions like, what's the best aspect of this submission? What's the most interesting or surprising part of the submission and why? What's the best or least developed point and why? Things like that. Or you could use the Moodle workshop activity to provide inspiration for continuing research. You could have the students look at a submission and then answer questions like, what questions remain in your mind after reading this submission? What points remain unclear? Where is there a potential to develop the research further? Things like that. Okay, let's look at how the Moodle workshop activity works. Moodle workshop activity looks complicated. If you just went into Moodle and added it as an activity, you would, without any background knowledge, you'd probably look at it and say, wow, can't figure this out, forget it, I give up. It looks complicated until you understand how it works. So let me give you a review of its different phases and how grading works in it, and then I'll actually go over to Moodle and show you a couple of examples of the workshop activities. I have 4 of them set up. Okay, there are 5 phases of the Moodle Workshop activity. The first one is the setup phase. This is where you go to add an activity or resource and you add the workshop activity. In this setup phase, you can add a description of the workshop. You can add the instructions for submissions, and you set up the assessment form for the students to do their self-assessment or their peer assessment. If you choose to, you can include sample submissions and sample assessments of those submissions so the students can see this is an example of a good submission or this is an example of a good assessment of a submission. And when you're in the setup phase, the students can neither submit nor assess. They see the activity there, but when they click on it, it just says it's not ready for you yet. The next phase of the Moodle Workshop activity, you have added all of that stuff and you push the activity to the submission phase. At this point, the students can submit their work. It looks just like any other activity submission that you've seen in Moodle. And they can submit their work either in the inline text editor or as file attachments. And as the submissions come in, the instructor can set up the instructions for the assessment, and the instructor can assign who is going to assess which submissions. So in other words, if you've got 6 people in your class, student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and student 1 has submitted their work, then you can say, okay, student 2 and 3 is going to assess student 1. So that's what you would be doing as the instructor in the submission phase. Once all the assessment allocations are made, the instructor would push the workshop activity to the assessment phase. In the assessment phase, the students can see who they're supposed to assess, and they can see the submission that they're supposed to assess. They read it and they assess it based on the form that you have created. As the instructor in this phase, if you would also like to assess students' work, that's when you're able to do it. So you can add your own assessment based on your own form. Now, there are 4 different types of assessments that the student or the instructor can do, and they're called accumulative, comment, number of errors, or rubric. Accumulative assessments allow the students or the instructor to give a number of points to the assessment. So, in other words, in an accumulative assessment, there might be 5 questions that the instructor has the students answer, and the students can give a number of points that the instructor defines to demonstrate how well or how poorly they think that their peers' submission meets up to the standards that the professor has defined. So accumulative gives points. For comment assessments, there are no points, nothing but comments. So the instructor would ask a question like, what's the most interesting point in this submission? And the assessor, the student assessor, would have to answer that question with a comment. For a number of errors assessment, the instructor would ask questions like, does this submission contain numerous grammatical errors or excessive grammatical errors maybe? And the student assessor would answer yes or no, that type of thing. And then rubric is exactly what you expect it to be. You create a rubric and the students have to rate the assessment or rate the submission based on the rubric that you've created. And we'll look at each one of those types of assessments when we move over into Moodle. Once the students have completed the assessments of their peers' submission, then the instructor pushes the workshop activity into the grading phase. In the grading phase, the instructor reviews the submissions and the peer assessments. And at this point, the instructor can make his or her own comments, and the instructor can override grading if they want to. During this phase, the students are waiting to see what their grade is going to be. They can neither submit nor can they assess during this phase, and they can't yet see their grades. And then finally, once the instructor has reviewed the grades and agreed that they're all okay or made any changes that he or she wants to make, then the instructor pushes the activity into the closed phase. And when the activity is in the closed phase, that is when the students can see their grades in the gradebook. Okay, so those are the phases of a Moodle workshop activity. Remember, in the closed phase, the students are going to see a grade for their submission, and they're going to see a grade for their assessment of their peers' submissions. So let's look for a second at how those grades are determined. First of all, let's look at the submission grade. Suppose that you've got a class, and in the class you've got John, Sam, and Harry. John turns in a submission, and it is going to be assessed by Sam and Harry and the instructor. Sam's submission is going to be assessed by John and Harry and the instructor. And Harry's submission is going to be assessed by John and Sam and the instructor. So, let's suppose that it is a number of errors assessment, and if the submission gets 4 yeses, yes, and what that means is yes, an answer like yes, there are no grammatical errors, yes, there are no spelling errors, yes, it has the proper number of sources, that sort of thing. If John gets 4 yeses, he'll get a 100. If he gets 3 yeses, he'll get a 75. 2 yeses, he'll get a 50. 1 yes, he'll get a 25. And no yeses, he'll get a 0. So, Sam does his assessment, and he gives John a 100%. He says John has included everything that he's supposed to. Harry does his assessment, and he says, well, John didn't include the first item that he was supposed to, but he did include all the others. So Harry gives John a 75. And the instructor does his assessment, and he agrees with Harry. He says that John did not include the first aspect of the assignment, but he did do the other 3. So how is John's submission grade going to be determined then? It is going to be an average of Sam's assessment, Harry's assessment, and the instructor's assessment. So John is going to get an 83%. Now, the instructor can override that. The instructor can say, my grade is weighted more than Sam's and Harry's assessment, so I'm going to bring this grade down to whatever I want it to. But if you don't do anything to alter it, that is how the submission grade is going to be determined. Okay, how then is the assessment grade going to be determined? The assessment grade of John's submission, that grade is going to be given to Harry and Sam. Harry and Sam's assessments of John's work are going to also be graded. And how is that going to be done? The assessment grade is determined by a comparison with what the computer determines to be the best assessment. And how does the computer determine what is the best assessment? It looks at all the assessments that are given, and it tries to figure out what is the most commonly given assessment. So in this instance, where one person gave an assessment of yes, 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 and the other 2 people gave an assessment of no, yes, 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 the best assessment is going to be no, yes, yes, yes. And so when Sam and Harry's assessment grades are determined, Harry gave an assessment of no, yes, yes, yes. His assessment exactly matches what has been determined to be the best assessment. Therefore, he is going to have a higher assessment grade than Sam, who missed one of the 4 categories for the best assessment. So he's going to get a lower assessment grade. Now, how low his assessment grade is going to fall depends on how the instructor has configured the assessment grading to work. You have 5 options as an instructor. You can set assessment grading to be very lax, fair, strict, and very strict. If you set it to very strict, the assessment grade for somebody who did not align with the best assessment is going to be much lower than if you set the assessment grade to very lax. Okay. That may not be crystal clear right now. That's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to move over and look at this in Moodle. And once you see how it looks in Moodle, it's going to make a lot more sense. So I'm going to go ahead and break out of my PowerPoint and go over to my Moodle sandbox. This is my sandbox, and in my sandbox, I have created 4 workshop activities, 1 to demonstrate a cumulative assessment, 1 number of errors, 1 comments assessment, and 1 rubric assessment. But before I show you those, I'm going to show you how you would start out adding a workshop activity. To add a workshop activity, you have clicked the Turn Editing On button, and then you go to Add an Activity or Resource in the topic where you would like to add your workshop activity. And you scroll down until you see the workshop activity, and like always, you click Add. That will take you to a screen that looks really familiar. This part here looks like every other activity that you add in Moodle. You are asked to name your activity. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this Test During the Webinar. And then you are asked to add a description of your activity. So I have a description already typed up. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it in here. In this workshop, you'll practice using the CRAP test to determine if a source you have selected for your research paper is appropriate or not. And like always, you can check this box if you want this description to show up on your Moodle homepage, or you can leave it unchecked if you don't. That's just your basic setup, naming your workshop and putting in a basic description of it. Now, let's scroll down. The next thing that you have to choose is how you are going to do your assessments. And like I said, you have 4 options: cumulative grading, comments, number of errors, or rubric. A cumulative grading is going to allow the students to assign points to submissions. Comments are going to allow for comments only. No grade will be put in the gradebook. Number of errors is going to give you the ability to ask binary questions, yes or no type questions that the students have to answer to assess the submissions, or a rubric. For right now, I'll just go ahead and pick cumulative grading. Now, here you get to determine how much of the overall workshop grade is going to be based on the student's submission. In other words, the student's work. By default, that's set to 80%, but you can set it to anything you want. I'm just going to leave it at 80%. And if you want, you can add a grade to pass. Now, the next grade that you have to set up is the grade for assessment. You have to say how much of the grade for the overall workshop is going to be based on the student's assessment of their peers' work. By default, that's 20% of the workshop grade. But again, you can drop that down and set it to anything you want. But this and this have to add up to 100. If you want, you can set an assessment grade to pass. Okay, once you've done that, you can go to submission settings. Here, you are setting up what instructions for what the students need to do when they submit their own work. So this part is like any other assignment where the students are going to submit a Word document or an Excel document or something like that to you. So you just include your instructions for what you expect them to do. Type them right there. Submit a PDF copy or a URL link of a source you intend to use for your research paper. This source should be one you believe is appropriate for use in a scholarly research paper. So that's the instructions. That's what I want my students to do. Just submit a PDF of a source for their research paper. But this might also be where you have them submit a 500-word essay on such and such, or the rough draft of their research paper, or whatever. Now you can set right here how many attachments they can include, how big the attachment might be, and you can check this if you want them to be allowed to submit after the deadline. Once you've done that, you've done everything you need to do for the submission. Now, the second half of the workshop activity is the assessment. Here, in the initial setup of the workshop, all you can do is add the general instructions for the assessment and determine if the students are going to assess their own work. So, my general instructions for my little test workshop here are use the criteria described in the CRAP test to evaluate if the source submitted is appropriate for use in a scholarly research paper. Just the directions. And I'm going to go ahead and check to say that students can assess their own work. If I check that, then students will obviously be allowed to use my assessment form against their own work in addition to their peers. Okay? Those are the things that you must do. It won't let you go on if you don't do the assessment settings, the submission settings, the grading settings, and general. Now, there are additional things you can do. Under feedback, you can mark whether the students are able to give wordy feedback. In other words, something that they typed up, a paragraph or a sentence in feedback. You can say that that feedback is enabled and optional. You can say that it's disabled, students can't give a paragraph of feedback, or you can say that it is enabled and required. Enabled and optional is the default. So if you don't want that, you'll want to go into feedback and either disable it or make it required. Also under feedback, you are able to put in a conclusion of the workshop activity. The students are going to see that during the grading phase. And what this is maybe a little summary of what you hoped your students would learn from this activity. So in my case, for my little test workshop activity, I'll put in this activity, you've worked with the CRAP test criteria, apparently I can't spell, for determining if a source is appropriate for a research paper. You should apply the CRAP test to every source you choose for a class paper. So you can put that in as a conclusion. Another optional thing that you can set up is to allow for example submissions. An example submission would be one that you put in order to show the students either a good example or a negative example. If you check this, then you'll be able to provide the example. And then there's a drop down here, and you can decide whether looking at that, assessing that example is going to be voluntary, whether it's going to be required before the person submits their own work, or whether the example is available after the person has submitted their own submission, but it has to be assessed before they do their peer assessment. And that's obviously up to you. Some people would prefer to say that the submission is available after the students turn in their own submission so that they don't try to steal ideas. Some people may want to require the students to look at the example before their own submission so that they get an idea of what's expected. It's totally up to you. Then, like every other assignment in Moodle, you can set availability dates if you want to. And then these 3 settings we recommend that you don't mess with. Once you've got everything done that you want to, you click Save and Display. And now you're finally going to get to see what this looks like in Moodle. This is what you and your students would see at this point. And you can see the 5 different phases that I talked about in the PowerPoint. You have the setup phase, the submission phase, the assessment phase, the grading and evaluation phase, and the closed phase. And you can see that Moodle walks you through this. It tells you that you have set the workshop description, green checkbox. It tells you that you've provided instructions for submission, green check. But it does tell you that you have to edit your assessment form, gray checkbox there, and that you have to prepare example submissions. Since I said that I wanted sample example submissions, it tells me that I have to do them. If I had not checked that box, this would not be there, and neither would this link. Notice if I try to do my example submission first, it tells me you have to define the assessment form before you can provide the example submission. So let's go ahead and see how would you do an assessment form. In order to edit any of the things that are required in each phase, you just click on the link. You can see that all of these that you can edit are links. So if I don't like my workshop description, if I want to change it, I can just click on this link and it'll take me back there and I can change it. But I'm going to work on this gray checkbox, edit the assessment form. And this is going to give me an accumulative grading assessment form because that's the type of grading that I chose. If I get here and I look at this and I say to myself, oh, you know what? I don't think I want the students to do points. I'd rather have them do comments. Then I would have to go back to my test workshop and I would have to go down to the administrative block and go to edit settings. And then I get back to where I can see this grading settings. And I could change this to number of errors instead and click Save and Display. And then when I go back to edit my assessment form, it looks a little bit different. Rather than getting to add points, I can only say yes or no things. Okay, so how do I make my assessment form? I put in under description what I want the students to assess. So I might say something like, does the submission have excessive, I hope I spelled that right, grammatical errors? And then I can either say no or yes. If I want to add another assertion, I just drop this down and I say, I put my next question in. Does the submission have the required number of sources? No or yes, etc. If I want to add more criteria, I can click here to add 2 more blanks, however long I want. If I want to see what this is going to look like for students, I can click Save and Preview. This is what the students will see. Does the submission have excessive grammatical errors? Check yes or check no and make a comment. And then the next question and the overall feedback. So once the students read what their peer has submitted, then they can go to this assessment form and kind of grade their peer. Okay, so once I have edited the assessment form in the setup phase, you see now I have the ability to add a sample submission. I have this little button. So I click the button and it allows me to put a title in, sample submission. You can call it anything you want. And I can either type in the content in line or I can upload a file, just like the students can do. So I'll just go ahead and upload a file and click Save Changes. And now it will ask me to continue to add a example assessment. And so I would go ahead and do that. So I can say no excessive grammatical errors and make a good comment here so the students can see the types of comments that you're looking for. Does the submission have the required number of sources? Yes, and you could put something like all the sources are scholarly, peer-reviewed journals. Good job. Something like that, you know, whatever would be a good example of a comment. And then you can put your sample overall comment here, and you can save and close. So once you've done that, you see you've got all green check marks in your setup phase. You have created a workshop description, instructions for submission, an assessment form that students will use to assess their peers' work, and you've created an example submission and an example assessment of the submission that students can look at. So you are ready now for students to see this workshop. So you push it to the submission phase by clicking the little light bulb. When you do that and click continue, you see that everything has gone, your green highlight has gone over here. And now students can see the workshop, what they're supposed to do, and they're able to make submissions. Let's look at an example of one where students have already done submissions. In this case, this workshop is in the submission phase, and Ellen Bloomfield has made a submission and Brittany Netherton has made a submission. In this phase, remember, the instructor can allocate submissions. In other words, the instructor says who is going to grade whose work. To do that, you click on the Allocate Submissions link, and you can either do it manually by adding a reviewer from the drop-down, or if you've got a big class and you don't want to do it manually, you can do a random allocation by choosing that each submission is going to get at least a certain number of reviews. And you can say here that participants can go ahead and start reviewing without submitting anything. And here you can add self-assessments. And once you've either done manual or random, you can see that Ellen is going to be reviewed by Brittany and by herself, since I chose self-assessment. And Brittany is going to be reviewed by Ellen and by herself, since I chose self-assessment. Let's go ahead and look at one that's in the assessment phase. Once everybody's turned everything in and the submissions are allocated, the instructor would then push the workshop into the assessment phase, and then the students can see what they're supposed to assess. You, as the professor, can see who has turned things in, who is supposed to review them, and what grades they have given. Here is a course where the students have been graded. Ellen has been graded by me, the instructor, and given a 67, and by Brittany, a peer, and the peer gave her a 60. Brittany has been graded by her peer, Ellen, and she has received a 60. And she has been graded by me, the instructor, and she's been given a 60. And you can see that if you want to, you can reassess as the instructor either one of the submissions that are available in your class. And then you can push your workshop to the grading evaluation phase by clicking on the light bulb. And this is where you can choose. You see what the submission grades are. They are an average of the instructor's grade and the peer review. So Ellen will get a 63 for her submission. That's an average of 67 and 60. And then you will see she'll get 20 points, the full grade for her assessment. Both people are getting 20. This is where you can choose whether the assessment grade is going to be graded very lax, lax, fair, strict, or very strict. And your only option for the grading evaluation is comparison with the best assessment. Once you're satisfied with how your assessment grades are, then you push the workshop to closed, and the students will be able to see their grades in the gradebook. So if I go over to the gradebook for this course, then you can see for the one that we have pushed to the closed phase, they receive for their submission grade a 63 and for their assessment grade a 20 for a total of 83 points. Okay, that is how the workshop activity works. I just wanted to show you one last thing, and that was the rubric so that you could see the rubric grading, the way that it actually looks. We're going to go ahead and look at that assessment form. When you want to set up grading by a rubric, you put your criterion here and the descriptions of how many points are earned in your ranges here, and then I'll show you what this looks like in a preview. The students get an assessment form that looks like this nice little rubric, and so they just have to click whatever is the most appropriate answer in their opinion, and then they have a place for feedback. So the rubric is I really like this particular form of assessment. My two favorite forms of assessment are this rubric and the one where they do number of errors. So they choose a yes or a no and they have to put in comments. Okay, that's a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, somebody asks, can I please send a copy of the presentation? I absolutely will. I can go ahead and put it in the handouts here. Everybody ought to be able to get a copy of the PowerPoint from the handouts section over there. If you have any trouble getting that, you can go ahead and email me. I'll go ahead and put my email address in here. You can go ahead and email me at kmanny@midway.edu if you have any questions at all on this topic. We will also be putting the recording of tonight's session on the center's website, and I will send a link out to all faculty for that recording. So you can have an opportunity, if you do decide to use the workshop activity, you'll have an opportunity to kind of watch the recording as you set it up. Okay? Okay, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. It was a long webinar and a kind of complicated topic. I appreciate very much you hanging in there for it, and I hope that you find some great uses for the workshop activity in Moodle. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, but I will stay in the room for a second until everybody leaves in case anybody else has any questions.